This is the first part of the review of Chapter 5, which focuses on the skeleton. This part will begin with an overview of this system, and we will then look at the anatomy of bone in more detail. In addition, we will look at some developmental aspects of bone. Apart from the obvious abundance of bone tissue, the skeletal system structures also include fibrous connective tissue in the ligaments and types of cartilage tissue, both important structural components of not only joints, but also of the bones themselves. The bones should be considered as the central organs of the system, and apart from the obvious role in support and protection, the bones serve several other very important functions as listed here. As any other connective tissue type, bone is composed of cells as well as an extracellular matrix, which in the case of bone is primarily composed of inorganic calcium salts as well as organic collagen fibers. There are two main forms of bone tissue, namely compact and spongy bone. As we will see, compact bone contains abundant structures called osteons. The outermost layer of connective tissue surrounding the bones is called the periosteum. Figure 5.1 describes the typical structure of bone. Note the osteons we mentioned in the last slide. Also note that the central cavity of the diaphysis contains yellow marrow made mostly of adipose tissue, and that the spongy bone at the epiphyses contains red marrow, which is involved in the production of blood cells of all types. The bones are held together primarily through ligaments made of dense fibrous connective tissue. These sites of attachments are known as joints or articulations. Cartilage is another important component of the skeletal system. Here are the three main types of cartilage that you'll find. Note that only fibrocartilage and hyaline cartilage are involved as structural components of joints. Before we talk about how bone forms, grows, and remodels itself, you should be familiar with the names of the cells involved in these processes, and these are listed here. We next turn to a description of how bone forms during development of the fetus in the womb. The main way most bones form is through a process called endochondral ossification. In this process, bone begins as a cartilage model, which later becomes replaced by bone through the activity of osteoblasts, the cells that deposit bone. Once formed, bones continue to grow in length throughout adolescence at the growth plates, as described shortly. Figure 5.2 shows how bone develops. Note that by birth, step C, much of the cartilage model has been transformed into bone, but a thin sliver of cartilage remains at the epiphyses, which now form what is known as the growth plate. Figure 5.3 shows how long bones increase in length. As you see here, the growth plate of cartilage is actually what grows throughout adolescence. As the cartilage keeps forming, it is progressively changed into bone by osteoblasts behind the plate. As sex and growth hormones continue to peak, eventually the osteoblasts will catch up to the chondroblasts, and at that point the bone stops growing in length because there will no longer be any more cells to maintain the extension of the growth plate. This event is frequently referred to as the closure of the growth plate. Once the growth plate closes, however, the bone can continue to change shape and change in thickness and density. However, after the age of about 40, bone progressively loses density. When this imbalance is severe, it is known as osteoporosis. Figure 5.4 shows how bone remodeling can occur in response to stresses on the bone. This makes a strong point. Bone is a very dynamic, living and breathing kind of structure. Another example that clarifies this more, perhaps, is the fact that at zero or reduced gravity, bone will quickly lose density and become very fragile. Consider all the lengths astronauts go through while at zero gravity in order to maintain bone density. Unfortunately, I think many still think that bones in your body are dead and static structures. Two hormones have important effects to consider in the regulation of bone density, mostly due to the abundance of calcium in the matrix of bone. Of these, PTH plays a central role in this process. As you will see in later lectures, maintaining an adequate level of blood calcium will be critical for many body functions, such as nerve conduction and muscle contraction. When blood calcium levels fall, the bone then becomes an important source of calcium. Okay, this is the end of the short overview, first part of chapter 5. In the next part, we will describe the various parts of the human skeleton.